In the spring of 1862, along the muddy banks of the Alabama River near Selma, 7 men died in the span of 14 weeks inside a tobacco barn on the Covington plantation. Their deaths were ruled accidental by the county coroner, attributed to falls, equipment failures, and one case of alleged heart failure. But whispers traveled through the slave quarters like fever, and those whispers carried a single name, Dina. You are on the channel Shadows of the South, where we unearth the most disturbing and forgotten stories of the slave-holding South. Stories that reveal the moral rot at the foundation of a society built on human bondage. The Covington estate sprawled across nearly 2,000 acres of prime Alabama bottomland, its fields thick with tobacco plants that turned the soil black with their roots. Colonel Marcus Covington, 47 years old, was a man of considerable education, having studied law at the University of Virginia before inheriting his father's holdings in 1849. He fancied himself a progressive master, a believer in what he called enlightened stewardship, though this enlightenment extended only to ensuring his property remained productive and his 237 enslaved workers remained alive enough to labor. He was tall, with graying temples and the kind of face that appeared trustworthy in church pews, the sort of man who quoted scripture while calculating the value of human flesh in his ledgers. His wife, Catherine, 39, was the daughter of a Charleston shipping merchant, educated at a girls' academy, fluent in French, and possessor of a moral certitude that allowed her to sleep soundly in a house built on suffering. Among the enslaved population at Covington, 8 individuals would become central to the events that unfolded. There was Moses, 52, the head driver, a man whose back bore the scars of 30 years of field work and whose eyes had learned to show nothing. Beside him worked his son, Isaiah, 28, tall and broad-shouldered, who had been promised his freedom 3 times and betrayed 3 times. There was Sarah, 45, who cooked in the big house and had lost 4 children to Saleh before they turned 10. Her daughter Ruth, 22, worked in the laundry and sang hymns that made the overseers uncomfortable with their particular emphasis on deliverance and judgment. In the tobacco barns worked Jacob, 35, who had been purchased from a Virginia estate and still bore the brand of his previous owner on his shoulder, and Elijah, 19, who was Moses' nephew and possessed a dangerous spark of defiance that no amount of punishment had extinguished. There was also Thomas, 41, a carpenter whose skill made him valuable enough to avoid the worst brutalities, and finally, Dinah herself. Dinah was 33 years old in the winter of 1862. She had been born on the Covington plantation, the daughter of a woman whose name had been deliberately erased from all records after she took her own life in 1835. Dinah worked primarily in the tobacco barns during curing season, a position that required knowledge of temperature, humidity, and timing. She was neither beautiful nor plain, neither tall nor short, the kind of woman who moved through spaces without drawing attention, which was perhaps the most valuable skill an enslaved woman could possess. Her eyes were dark and deep-set, her hands calloused from decades of labor, and her voice, on the rare occasions she spoke to white ears, was soft and deferential. But those who knew her in the quarters understood something else. Dinah possessed a mind of remarkable clarity and a memory that forgot nothing. The triggering incident occurred on a February evening in 1862, though its roots reached back years before. Colonel Covington had developed a practice, never spoken of openly but understood by all, of selecting certain enslaved women for his private use. This was not unusual in the South. Such arrangements were woven into the very fabric of plantation society, hidden beneath layers of propriety and Christian devotion. But Covington's particular obsession had fixed itself upon Ruth, Sarah's daughter, beginning when the girl turned 16. For 6 years, this violation had continued, and for 6 years, Sarah had been forced to watch her daughter's light slowly extinguish, replaced by a hollow-eyed resignation that was itself a kind of death. On that February night, Ruth hanged herself from a beam in the laundry house. She was 22 years old. She left no note, for she could not write, but her mother found her in the pale dawn, her body swaying slightly in the cold wind that crept through the cracks in the walls. The overseer, a man named Dalton, recorded death in his log as natural causes, with the notation that the Negro girl had been melancholy of temperament. Colonel Covington attended the brief burial in the slave cemetery, standing at a respectful distance, his hat held over his heart, his face arranged in an expression of benevolent sorrow. Pause for a moment and consider this. In a world where even grief was owned, where even death could be rewritten in a master's ledger, what remained for those who suffered? What forms could justice take when the law itself was the instrument of oppression? 3 days after Ruth's burial, the first man died. His name was Wyatt, an overseer, 31 years old, known for his particular cruelty and his enthusiasm with the whip. He was found in the curing barn, where Dina worked, his neck broken, lying beneath a fallen beam. The official explanation was that he had been inspecting the upper racks, lost his footing, and pulled the beam down upon himself in his fall. It seemed plausible enough. Accidents happened, especially in the barns where heavy timber supported tons of drying tobacco. Dina had been the one to discover the body, her screams bringing the other workers running. She had been questioned briefly, her hands shaking as she explained that she had been working in the adjacent section and heard only the terrible crash. No one suspected anything beyond misfortune. The second death came 19 days later. Henry Walsh, a neighboring planter who often visited Covington to discuss crop prices and political matters, was found dead in the same barn. This time, the cause was determined to be a heart attack, though Walsh was only 42 and had seemed in robust health the previous day. He had been touring the curing operation with the colonel, admiring the quality of the tobacco, when he had asked to use the facilities. He never emerged. His body was discovered by Moses, lying on the barn floor, his face purple, his hands clutched at his chest. The county doctor, a man named Brennan, who drank more than he practiced medicine, performed a cursory examination and declared it a natural death, tragic but not uncommon in men of certain constitution. It was after the third death that some began to notice patterns, though few spoke of them openly. The victim this time was James Sutton, Covington's chief overseer, a man of 45 who had worked the plantation for nearly 2 decades. He had been known to select certain young enslaved women for his attentions, exercising what he considered his right as a man of authority. His death was more dramatic than the others. He was found impaled on a tobacco spear, the long iron spike that was used to string tobacco leaves for hanging. The official story was that he had tripped while carrying the implement, falling forward onto its point. It was a horrific accident, the kind that made men wince and cross themselves, but accident they were familiar with. Farm work was dangerous. Tools were sharp. Men died. By now, however, a different narrative was circulating through the slave quarters, passed in whispers during the brief moments when eyes were not watching, spoken in coded language that white ears could not decipher. They said that Dena was settling accounts. They said that each man who died had been involved in some way in Ruth's destruction. Wyatt had been the one who dragged Ruth to the coroner's house that first time, ignoring her mother's pleas. Walsh had been present at a gathering where Ruth had been forced to serve, and his hens had wandered where they had no right to go. Sutton had, on multiple occasions, threatened Sarah with Sally if she made any trouble about her daughter's situation. The fourth death was John Pritchard, a cotton factor from Mobile, who had business dealings with Covington. He died of what appeared to be poisoning, though the symptoms could also have been attributed to bad meat or contaminated water. He had taken ill violently after dining at the plantation, and despite Dr. Brennan's ministrations, he expired within 12 hours. Pritchard, it was known among the enslaved community, had once tried to purchase Ruth for his own household, offering Covington a handsome price for a woman he described as comely and broken in. The fifth victim was Robert Dalton, the very overseer who had written natural causes in his log when Ruth died. His death was perhaps the most mysterious. He was found in the barn at dawn, his body cold, his face frozen in an expression of terror, with no marks upon him and no apparent cause. Dr. Brennan, growing increasingly nervous about his professional reputation, suggested that Dalton might have suffered a seizure or a stroke, though the man had been only 34 and healthy as a horse the day before. In a society where murder was legal, so long as the victim was black, where rap carried no penalty if the violated were enslaved, where every form of human degradation was sanctioned by law and blessed by pulpit, is it any wonder that justice sought other channels? Is it any wonder that the powerless, denied every avenue of redress, might turn to methods that the powerful could neither see nor comprehend? By the time the sixth man died, Colonel Covington himself was beginning to feel the cold finger of Une. That man was William Hodge, a slave trader who had been visiting the plantation to evaluate some of Covington's younger male slaves for potential sale to Mississippi. Hodge had also, according to the whispered testimony of those who had witnessed it, been the one who had told Covington that Ruth was getting too old to be useful and should be either worked harder or sold south. They when a stack of hogsheads, the large barrels used to store processed tobacco, somehow became unbalanced and crushed him against the barn wall. The physics of the accident seemed improbable to some but not impossible, and there were no witnesses to the actual moment of collapse. Colonel Covington called for a meeting of the overseers and senior enslaved workers. Standing in the barn where so much death had occurred, he spoke of the terrible misfortunes that had befallen the plantation, attributing them to God's mysterious will, to the trials of war, to the general decline in moral standards that accompanied the conflict with the Norse. He announced new safety procedures, new inspections, new protocols. He also, though he did not say so explicitly, began to avoid the barns entirely, conducting his business from the comfort of his study. But there was one more death to come. The seventh victim was perhaps the most significant, for he was Colonel Marcus Covington himself. On a humid July evening in 1862, he was found dead in the tobacco barn, hanging from a beam by a rope that he apparently had placed around his own neck. The stool he had presumably stood upon lay kicked over beneath his dangling feet, The county coroner, colons again to the Covington plantation, ruled it a suicide, attributing it to the stresses of war, financial pressures, and the accumulated grief of the recent tragedies. Catherine Covington, his widow, accepted this finding with a stony silence that would characterize the rest of her life. Yet those who had been in the quarters that night told a different story among themselves. They said that Dina had gone to the colonel's study earlier that evening, summoned for questioning about the deaths. They said that she had spoken to him quietly for nearly an hour, that her voice had never risen above a whisper, that when she emerged, the colonel's face was the color of old ashes. They said that he walked to the barn of his own volition, that he carried the rope himself, that he climbed onto the stool without anyone's hand touching him. They said that Dinah had given him a choice to die by his own hand with some shred of dignity intact, or to have the truth about Ruth, about the 6 men, about everything he had done and permitted and profited from, spread across Alabama like wildfire. They said she had shown him a list of names, written in a careful hand that should have been impossible for an enslaved woman to possess, names of other men who had participated or known about Ruth's suffering, and said nothing. If you have stayed with this story thus far, if you have felt the weight of these terrible truths, then you understand why we must continue to tell them. Subscribe to Shadows of the South to receive more accounts like this, stories that refuse to let the past remain buried, that insist on bearing witness to what was done in the name of profit and power. No one ever found that list, if it existed. No one ever proved that Dinah had anything to do with the 7 deaths that haunted the Covington plantation in the spring of 1862. She continued to work in the tobacco barns, continued to move through spaces without being noticed, continued to live as she had always lived, in the margins of a world that considered her property. When the war ended and freedom came, she was 44 years old. She took her mother's forgotten name, calling herself Dinah Freeman, and she walked north, away from Alabama, away from the plantation, away from the barns where 7 men had died. Sarah, Ruth's mother, lived another 23 years, dying in 1885 in a small house in Birmingham that she owned outright, having saved every penny she earned as a laundress after emancipation. She never spoke publicly about her daughter's death or the events that followed, but she kept a small garden behind her house where she grew tobacco plants, never harvesting them, just watching them grow and wither with the seasons, a living memorial to what had been taken and what perhaps had been reclaimed. Moses the driver lived to see his grandchildren born free, dying in 1881 at the age of 71. His son Isaiah became a carpenter after the war, traveling throughout Alabama building churches and schools for the freed people. He never spoke of the tobacco barn or the men who died there, but he named his first daughter Ruth, and when asked why, he would only say that it was a name that deserved to be remembered with honor. Catherine Covington sold the plantation in 1863, unable to bear the property that had claimed her husband's life. She moved to Mobile, where she lived quietly until her death in 1879, never remarrying, never speaking of Alabama, never mentioning the spring of 1862 in any letter or diary that survived her. The Covington plantation was subdivided and sold to multiple owners, and within a generation, no one could remember where the old tobacco barns had stood or what had happened there during the war. Consider for a final moment the nature of power and its costs. Consider what happens when human beings are given absolute authority over other human beings, when law and custom and religion all conspire to tell them that such authority is natural, proper, and ordained by God. Consider what happens to the souls of those who wield such power, and to the souls of those who suffer under it. Consider whether justice delayed is justice denied, or whether it is simply justice taking the only form available to it in a world designed to prevent its manifestation. The tobacco barn where the 7 men died burned to the ground in a lightning strike in 1867, though some of the freed people who witnessed it said they had seen no storm, heard no thunder, only watched as flames consumed the structure on a clear summer evening. No one rebuilt it. The land where it stood remained empty for decades, grown over with kudzu and honeysuckle, until even those who had been enslaved there could no longer remember where it had been. What did Dena do to those 7 men, if she did anything at all? The historical record offers no confession, no evidence, no testimony that would stand in any court. Perhaps she simply possessed knowledge of the barns and their dangers, knowledge of men and their fears, knowledge of men and their fears, knowledge of poisons that grew wild in Alabama fields, knowledge of psychological manipulation and strategic timing. Perhaps she did nothing at all, and the deaths were exactly what they appeared to be, a series of tragic accidents and natural cause, made remarkable only by their proximity in time and space. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere in the middle, in the gray spaces where history refuses to speak clearly, where the oppressed found methods of resistance that the oppressors could neither see nor comprehend. But this much is certain: 7 men died in the spring of 1862 in a tobacco barn in Alabama, and all 7 had played some role, great or small, in the destruction of a young woman named Ruth, who took her own life rather than continue to endure what was being done to her. As much is certain, the system that allowed such things to happen, that made them not crimes but commonplaces, was a system that destroyed not only those it enslaved, but also those who benefited from that enslavement. Colonel Marcus Covington, with his education and his Christianity and his belief in enlightened stewardship, ended his life on a rope in a barn, surrounded by the tools of an industry built on stolen labor and stolen lives. Whatever else may be said, whatever mysteries may remain unsolved, that much is undeniable fact. The story of Dena and the 7 deaths asks us to confront uncomfortable questions about justice and vengeance, about powerlessness and resistance, about powerlessness and resistance, about the moral consequences of a society built on human bondage. It asks us to consider what happens when legal systems exist solely to protect the powerful and oppress the weak, when every official channel of justice is closed to those who need it most. It asks us to think about the lives of those who were considered property, who were denied even the basic human right to protect themselves and their loved ones, who were forced to watch as everything they cherished was systematically destroyed by those who had absolute power over them. In the decades after the war, when veterans gathered to tell their stories and historians began to document the conflict, the South constructed a mythology around its lost cause, a narrative of noble gentlemen and gracious ladies, of faithful servants and benevolent masters, of a civilization tragically destroyed by northern aggression. This mythology had no place for women like Ruth, who died because the law considered her less than human, or for women like Dinah, who may or may not have sought justice through the only means available to her. It had no place for the 237 enslaved people on the Covington plantation. who toiled and suffered and died, so that tobacco could be grown and processed and sold, so that wealth could accumulate in the hands of men who convinced themselves that they were fulfilling God's plan. These stories, the ones that reveal the truth beneath the mythology, the ones that center the experiences of the enslaved rather than the enslavers, the ones that refuse to sanitize or romanticize or excuse. These are the stories that must be told. They are uncomfortable stories that make us question inherited narratives and comfortable assumptions, stories that insist on the full humanity of people who were denied that humanity by law and custom. The legacy of slavery extends far beyond the legal abolition of the institution in 1865. It echoes through generations, through land ownership patterns and educational disparities, through wealth gaps and criminal justice inequities, through all the ways that power, once established, perpetuates itself even after its original justifications have been discredited. The tobacco barns are gone now, burned or rotted away, but the soil they stood upon still bears the marks of what was done there, still holds the memory of those who labored without hope of justice or recompense. We tell these stories not to sensationalize or to seek entertainment in suffering, but to bear witness, to insist on truth, to refuse the comfortable lies that allow us to look away from history's most painful chapters. We tell them because Ruth's name deserves to be spoken, because the 237 people enslaved on the Covington plantation deserve to be remembered as more than property, as human beings with hopes and griefs and lives that mattered. We tell them because understanding the past is the only way to comprehend the present, to see how the structures of oppression built centuries ago still shape the world we inhabit today. Dinah of Alabama vanished into the anonymity that freedom offered, her fate unknown, her story untold, except in whispers and fragments. But the questions she embodied remain with us still. What is justice in a world designed to prevent it? What recourse exists for the powerless when power itself is the source of their suffering? How do we reckon with a past built on such profound moral failure, when even asking these questions forces us to confront our own complicity in systems of oppression that persist in different forms? These are the stories that Shadows of the South is committed to telling, the stories that demand to be excavated from the silences and erasures that have buried them for too long. They are not easy stories, not comfortable stories, but they are necessary ones, essential to any honest accounting of who we were and who we are. The 7 men who died in the Alabama tobacco barn in the spring of 1862 were individuals with their own stories, their own families, their own hopes and fears, but they were also participants in a system of organized brutality, beneficiaries of laws that treated human beings as chattel, wielders of power that corrupted everything it touched. Their deaths, whatever their exact causes, were consequences of choices they made in a world that gave them absolute authority over the lives of others. History, in the end, is not a simple narrative of heroes and villains, though the institution of slavery certainly had its share of both. It is a complex, painful, necessary accounting of what human beings are capable of doing to one another when law and custom and economic interest align to enable cruelty. It is a reminder that progress is neither inevitable nor irreversible, that the moral arc of the universe bends toward justice only when people bend it, often at great cost to themselves. And it is a warning that the failure to confront our history honestly, to face its full horror and complexity, condemns us to repeat its patterns in new forms. The tobacco barn is gone. The plantation is divided and forgotten. The 7 men are dust, but their story endures, asking its incomprehensible questions, refusing to let us look away, insisting that we remember not only what happened but why it was allowed to happen and what it cost, not just in lives, but in the very soul of a society that built its prosperity on human bondage. This is the work of history, the labor of memory, the obligation of those who come after to bear witness to what came before. However dark, however painful, however dark, however painful, however damning that witness may be.